Let's see. So I've been a CEO or at least a co-founder of companies since 2006. Uh, and I feel like I've received a lot of kind of confusing advice over the time. So I try to like define my own path, and I thought it'd be interesting to talk about it. Uh, there's some of the topics, but let me just dive into it. All right. So one of the things that I think is hard about being a CEO is you receive a lot of conflicting advice. I think one of the reasons that's hard is, uh, yeah, every company is kind of unique. The company is kind of a reflection of your personality, and also the industry is unique. Your competitive landscape's unique. So all these kind of unique factors mean that there's no one way to be a CEO, which is kind of a tricky thing if you're learning to be a CEO, because then you have all this advice and, yeah, so you can literally have two conversations back to back and they contradict each other. Like someone might be like, "Oh, hire tier A engineers from Google and Facebook," and the next person will say, "Yeah, these Google, Facebook engineers basically don't know how to work as a startup, and they're very slow and perfectionist and all that." Sorry if there's any Google, Facebook engineers here. And the other part that's like kind of weird is, if it's you're a 3-person company, you need to be a very different CEO to when you're a 10-person company, when you're a 50-person company. Mercury is a 750-person company, so you have to kind of expand what you do and how you do it, and the advice you are receiving might just not even apply to your actual like size. Often investors are where people turn to get this kind of advice. At least my general history with most investors is they're pretty bad at giving this advice. Most of them have never been a CEO, so they're really like basing most of their advice by how they observe other CEOs act, and they don't even really see a true observance of how a CEO acts, because when you talk to an investor as a CEO, you're always kind of acting up. So best place to go for CEO advice is other CEOs. But even then, if you're a seed stage company, I guess I've had a seed stage company for a long time over my years, but it's hard to like ask me for advice. I might be giving you advice that makes sense for a 750-person company. Whereas, if you had a 10,000-person company, I probably don't have that many useful things to say. So I generally find like you want to find peers that are quite close to you. Even then, it's always worth really understanding what they mean by the advice, why they think that advice applied to them. Basically, you don't want to, if someone says, go do X, you want to really understand what is their perspective and why, and then try to reverse engineer that into your own philosophy. Let me try to make it more concrete to a piece of advice that maybe I have received over time. When I was looking to hire my first exec, I think there was lots of advice around, do you hire an exec who has seen a really big company? So you're hiring an exec for, I don't know, let's say VP of sales, and you currently have 15 salespeople. And, do you hire someone that's seen a 300-person sales team? Do you hire someone who's already seen that, or maybe they were like position number 2? There's just so many nuances to all of this kind of advice that I got around hiring an exec. And at the end of the day, I had to go like, what is the type of person I want to work with? And I really prefer working with kind of up and comers that are really hungry, that have seen 0 to 1, but want to kind of prove themselves. But overall, that was a pretty annoying thing as a CEO, learning how to learn from others, which is kind of, I thought it would be fun to make a meta point before I tell you other lessons as my CEO, but feel free to ignore my lessons is the point. All right. Next one. This one I really struggled with. So, I did 3 companies before Mercury, and I would say I always kind of sucked at fundraising and mostly sucked at like investor relations and like all the things around investors. I think it's tempting, especially if you start kind of startup straight out of college, which is what I did. Life has like always got a boss, right? There's like your parents, and then you're in school, and then you maybe do your first company and there's a boss. So it's tempting to like project that relationship onto investors. It's actually, I think, a fairly natural thing to do. But I think it's very unhealthy. Firstly, if you treat someone in a certain way, then they actually start acting in that way. So if you treat them as a boss, they'll become your boss. They don't work at the company. They actually don't know that much about the company, right? Like maybe you're really good at investor communication, but most of the time you give them an update once a month. That's very little context on like what's actually happening, every day at your company. They're not an employee. So this dynamic is really unhealthy. And actually, I would say in general, investors do not want to be your boss. Yeah, they really want you to be the boss. Like they want you to run the company. They'll respect you a lot more if they're like, wow, this person like, turns to me for advice, but like knows what they're doing, has a strong opinion, and drives that up. And I would say most of the time when I talk to a founder that has a very difficult investor relationship, they have a difficult board, it's almost always because, in my opinion, they treated the investor like a boss. And now that's like become like a self-fulfilling kind of toxic relationship. I think the key is, straight after you close an investor, to stop treating them like you're selling to them. You want to start treating them like humans, which can be hard because you're still kind of nervous. But yeah, like build a relationship, get to know them, know where the kids go to school, all these kind of basic human things. And they should do the same. And really like stop making it about you're selling your company and start making it about like, hey, this is the problems we have. How do we solve these together? Make it a much more kind of constructive and authentic relationship. I'm also an active investor. I think the worst thing is like I've invested in the company and you go to a pitch, conversation afterwards and they're still pitching you hard. And they're like, oh my God, we just did this amazing thing and nothing is wrong with this company and everything's so amazing. And I'm like, I guess that could be true, but from my experience in startups, like it's very unlikely to be true. And if you're stoking like that with an investor, they can tell that you're just bullshitting them and it's not like a very constructive relationship. All right. So third topic. So something that I have noticed among a lot of founders. How many people are founders here? All right. How many people feel like they're stressed out and they don't have enough time and they're like, all that kind of stuff? All right, great. Most of you. That's because you're doing it wrong, is my rough take. Not really. Everyone feels like that. But I think there's like a very specific thing where like founders kind of, put themselves in this position where they're the bottleneck on everything. And the two main types of bottleneck are like, number one, they're the only person that can do one specific thing at a company. Maybe it's sales, maybe it's like engineering, something like that. And the second one is that nothing else can get done at the company without their input. I think that's like very natural. And when you're tiny, when you're like a 2-person company, it's like obvious that's what happens anyway. As you scale the company, it's important to try to remove yourself as a bottleneck. I guess the reason to remove yourself as a bottleneck is actually no one at your company enjoys you being a bottleneck. So, no one likes going to you for approval. If you're hiring smart, talented people, you should really give them trust and responsibility and leave them alone rather than be continuously trying to like micromanage everything. So that's bad. Founders are often very distracted, right? We're dealing with the next problem. We're fundraising. We're, dealing with the difficult employee, whatever it is. So if a founder is a bottleneck on some key task, that means there'll be periods where that thing just doesn't get done. Basically, try to hire yourself out of being a bottleneck. I actually think this last one is kind of subtle but important. I don't think in general the founder's job is to be a great manager. I think it's tempting to go like, oh, I'm really a people manager and I'm accelerating people. I mean, this is partly self-serving because I think I'm a much better leader than a manager. But I also just generally think like you want to be a leader, you want to set like a long-term vision and you kind of want to get out of the way in like how that's executed day to day. Apart from when there's a problem and you're fixing things. The last thing, which I think deeply ties to the previous point, how do you set up a situation where you as a founder are not at every single meetings and have to make every single decision? I think the way you do that is having a very transparent culture. A little story, in my last company, I think this is around 2013, we tried to do this fundraise where we're trying to raise a Series B, basically went for like 9 months and we completely failed. No Series B materialized. And, our previous Series A investor gave us $1 million. And we basically had $1 million to become profitable in 6 months. And we were very far from profitable. I think we were burning about $200K a month or something like that. Kind of been maybe $150K a month. So very tight timeline. And my initial instinct was, hey, don't tell the team about this. Just like come up with a plan and execute. I thought they would all leave. These were talented people. If you tell a bunch of people, hey, we've got 6 months and we're out of money, you kind of assume that they were late. We decided to do this different approach where we just laid out the whole thing for them and said like, hey, we just have 6 months. And we had a plan. So there was an idea of how we could become profitable. We had one revenue stream that was making like 40K a month or so. And we just kind of doubled down on that and we made it work. So that was a really big kind of eye-opening lesson to me about, building a transparent culture and how that can be a really powerful tool. I think one way that's like a little subtle and how it was helpful is I think as a founder, you can feel very like alone and feel like all of this is on your shoulders. Whereas if you're transparent with your team, then you can kind of share the burden, which I think is like a really powerful, feeling. So part of this is obviously if you're freaking out, this isn't going to work. If you're like, oh my God, we're dying here. It's got 6 months. I have no idea how we'll do this. That's not what I mean by transparent. Like, I think you still have to be very calm and reassuring. Like the tone has to be, we're going to do this together, and it has to be this kind of positive tone. So transparency is not like coming at people with like no answers and like throwing them kind of in the deep end or like changing your mind all the time. I think there's a few things that maybe you're not that transparent about. If it's a changing environment, you don't want to freak everyone out. Like you want to give it time to play out. I think sometimes as founders, you react a bit too quickly to what's happening, and it's worth like stepping back and giving it some. It's very rare that something needs to be acted on within a few hours. And I would say, take some time to like reflect and come up with a plan before being transparent. I mean, this is assuming this is some sort of difficult situation. I would also probably like pull in a few people into the initial planning phase. So, you might want to be sequential in how you're transparent. Like initially, maybe it's just with your co-founders and then with like the senior people, and then you kind of move forward, and that you can refine the plan before it's circulated. All right. That was it. I would say in general, founder mode as a concept is not very applicable to any company with less than 50 employees. Most likely you're already in founder mode. Otherwise you're doing something really weird. So I do think it's a concept that like once you have some scale and you have some managers and maybe middle managers, that's when you can get really detached from the details. The founder mode side is the exact opposite of being a bottleneck on lots of things. So if you imagine a world where like, you have 100-person company, but every single release needs to be approved by you. You're probably spending all your time in meetings. You're like saying, oh, this is good. This is not good. Like you're not stepping back and going like, what is the most important thing at this company? How do I dive all the way into the real details to solve it? I actually think in general, my interpretation, at least of founder mode, is very much in line with going deep on very specific things that are problems that you need to be like very hands-on with, that are like your superpower, while with most other things, like having a good structure that like people can self-manage around them. First thing is, I think it's really important to be co-founders with people that you've just worked with a long time already. I had a lot of issues in my first two companies with co-founders, and my next two, I picked people I'd already worked with. In the case of Mercury, I'd already worked with them for 5 years. I think that's, you establish exactly whether you work well together. It's quite an intense relationship. Number two, we always set kind of, boundaries of what each person owns and cares about. So, one of my co-founders is the CTO. He owns engineering. Someone else owns product and design. I own everything else. Setting these kind of clear boundaries makes it easy. Like if there is a disagreement, you're like, hey, I don't agree with this, but this is your kind of responsibility. So, you can run with it. I find those kind of like having clear degrees of like who controls what, most of the time that resolves most things. I think lastly, I've always been very unemotional about business. I mean, I'm emotional, but like, I feel like sometimes the worst arguments are when people get like emotionally invested in this answer and they're like, it must be like this, otherwise I'll be angry. I think if you avoid that, you can generally have like a pretty productive relationship with most people you work with. Series A is kind of like this fairly interesting point in the company where, there's still lots to prove out. Most Series A investors make like 2 or 3 investments a year. So they're making like, it's a big deal for them when they invest in you. I generally find that both for me and the investor, it's better if I have a relationship. If it's the first time I've ever met this person, expecting them to like shell out $10 million and like make one of their bets for the year in like a 2 week time period, it's like asking a lot. But I agree that it's bad idea to pitch them 6 months before. Ideally 9 months before. I just have a coffee meeting. I'm not pitching them. I'm just, getting to know them. Obviously, I'm explaining what I do, getting like a general vibe of like, is this something exciting to them? What kind of questions they ask? But, I don't talk about numbers. I don't make it a pitch. I like deliberately avoid any feeling of pitchness. There's no slide, nothing like that. And that's just purely like relationship building. And then when the actual time comes, then I know who to talk to. I know who's excited about it. Actually, like ideally, you're doing this every 6 months for the 2 years before your fundraise. And then you've kind of talked through and felt out like maybe 20 Series A investors. So by the time you come to a Series A like process, you have 8 that are excited about this. You know what their objections are going to be, and you have like a good understanding of who they are. And then I try to get a fundraise done in like 3 weeks. I've done the same thing for both seed and Series A and Series B. Before even the first week, I'll prepare a deck, a data room, get all the story, at least in my head, like lined up. And then the first week, I'll mostly spend with friendlies, other founders, existing investors, other people that you could just have a pitch with, screw it all up and like learn from. But they have to be like pretty smart and ideally relevant people. Based on that, I'll iterate the deck a little bit, iterate the story. Second week, I will aim for most of that week to talk to people I'm not that excited about, but maybe I'll take them out. Ideally, you do like 15 conversations in the first week. Second week, I'll store for like the people that I really want to get. These 8 people that you're really excited about, that you really want to close. And then ideally, at the end of the second week / the third week, you've got, partners meetings, and you're like pretty much doing the second, third meetings and like driving to a close. I feel like once you do this in a very compressed time period, you build a lot of momentum. You get a lot more confident in your pitch. You can play people off against each other, all that kind of stuff. I think sometimes startups tend to over-compromise at hiring. Hiring is really hard. It's very easy, I think, as a founder to go like, oh man, this is too much work. Like I've already spent like 1 month or 2 months hiring for this role. I'm just going to pick this person, even though they're not perfect, or even though there's like some red flags, but maybe it's fine. I think you actually want to keep a very high hiring bar. And it's better to maybe go a little more junior if you really can't find someone, but you want like high potential people, that you can really trust. I think part of the reason people don't delegate is because they can't trust the people underneath them. And that's like a self-fulfilling kind of prophecy, right? I have a tendency to over-delegate. I give them tons of responsibilities and like force them to kind of rise up to the challenge. And I'm often surprised how often people can rise up. I think the biggest issue we've had, and maybe this is a general issue, is when you have a lot of stuff going on, right? Like this team is supporting like this product and there's bugs and there's customer feedback and all this stuff. And then you go tell the team like, go ship this other new big thing. That's been my experience. The new thing we do is if there's a new big thing, we'll just say, hey, this whole team or these 2 engineers, they're just going to do this big thing. No matter what, they're not going to be interrupted unless it's like an existential emergency or something like that. So having like dedicated resources on that new big thing, that's made a huge difference to like actually shipping on time. This is actually also like anti a lot of Silicon Valley advice. I think the idea and the market matters a lot. I actually don't think I'm that much better of an entrepreneur with Mercury than I was in my previous company. And I mean, there's definitely lessons learned, but I was really hardworking there, and I was like reasonably good at engineering, right? A lot of the basics were there, but the idea was just not that good, right? I spent 8 years on like pivoting in that space, and there was just no way to come up with something good there, and no one else did either. Whereas with Mercury, we did really well pretty much after we launched. And I had this idea for Mercury in 2013, so kind of fermented in my brain for like 4 years before I really started working on it. Not an easy thing to ask, but having a really good idea that's like a pain point that you really understand, that you've like thought about for a long time, and it's in a really big market and it's the right time to do that idea. It's probably like the hardest aspect of entrepreneurship, but something that you could kind of take time and flesh out. And I wish I'd done that. I mostly think you should ignore competition. In my time, in the last, 17 years of doing startups, there's always been some competitor that's raised a bunch of money, that's like, seems to be hot and launching lots of things. And it never really mattered. Like most of the time we didn't do well because no one did well, or we didn't do well because we were doing bad things. I think it's much better to just ignore everything and focus on customers. You'll kind of learn about competition via customers. They'll be like, hey, I really need this feature. And then you'll be like, oh, why do you need it? And then they might say, oh, this person has it and it looks really good or whatever. So I think focusing on product, customers, and like creating what you think you should do is much better than thinking about competitors, having your roadmap determined by competitors. Like, yeah, every now and then a competitor copies some of our things and I'm like, well, that never worked. So go ahead. But it just seems like not a good strategy. So mostly I would say I don't think about competitors that much.